In recent years, the conversation around neurological disorders, especially autism spectrum disorder or ASD, has taken center stage. High-profile voices, including political figures and health advocates, have debated whether vaccines are to blame for the surge in autism diagnoses. This focus on vaccines often stems from understandable parental concerns and the fear that some environmental factor could be adversely affecting children's development. Yet, while the vaccine autism link has been thoroughly debunked by a wealth of scientific studies, the public discourse remains fixated on the vaccine question. Meanwhile, another invisible player has quietly emerged as a more likely culprit: electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, including radiofrequency radiation emitted by wireless devices, cell towers, and other modern technologies. With constant exposure to EMFs in our daily lives, mounting evidence suggests that these invisible waves may be more deeply implicated in the rise of neurological disorders than commonly acknowledged. This blog post aims to bring these overlooked factors into sharper focus. We will examine the often ignored role of EMFs and RFR, discuss the limitations of the just better diagnosis narrative, and explain why misclassifying RFR health risks is likely leading us astray. By the end, you'll understand why honing in exclusively on vaccines misses the broader environmental shift that's truly reshaping our children's developmental landscapes. The vaccine controversy, a brief overview, the debate in the public arena. President Donald Trump, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and other public figures have fueled ongoing debates about vaccines and their potential link to autism. In a recent exchange, highlighted in the video transcript we are expanding upon, questions arose about whether childhood vaccines should be re-examined due to rising autism rates. The argument made, if autism was once rare, why has it become so prevalent now? Some suggest that there must be an external trigger, citing vaccines as the prime suspect. Debunking the myth: vaccines and autism. Decades of research and multiple large-scale studies have not only failed to find a link between vaccines and autism, but have thoroughly debunked the original, now retracted studies that stirred this controversy. Scientific institutions, including the Institute of Medicine and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, agree that vaccines are safe and that they do not cause autism. The misconception persists, often overshadowing other environmental contributors that warrant investigation. Just better diagnosis is not the whole story. One common explanation offered is that the rise in autism rates can be attributed solely to better diagnostic criteria and increased awareness. While improved diagnostic methods have certainly played a role, it's increasingly clear that something else may be at play. Autism rates have outpaced what could be explained by improved detection alone, suggesting we must dig deeper into other factors, environmental disruptors that may affect biological processes critical to neurological development. The hidden factor: EMFs and the rise of neurological disorders. Understanding EMFs and RFR. Electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, and radiofrequency radiation, also known as RFR, have become ubiquitous. We encounter them in our homes, schools, workplaces, and public spaces. Everything from cordless phones to Wi-Fi routers, smartphones, and cell towers contributes to a constant background hum of EMFs. While these technologies have revolutionized our ability to communicate and access information, they have also created a new environmental landscape that our bodies have not evolved to navigate. A potential link to neurodevelopmental disorders. Studies increasingly suggest that EMFs could be impacting our health at the cellular and bioelectric levels. Instead of focusing solely on vaccines as a singular cause of increasing autism rates, it's essential to consider how EMFs might disrupt early brain development. Research points toward EMFs interfering with voltage-gated calcium channels, or VGCCs, mitochondrial function, and even epigenetic patterns, mechanisms all critical in shaping the developing brain. By introducing erratic noise into our bioelectric systems, EMFs may be creating a low-fidelity environment that confuses cellular communication, alters genetic expression, and increases oxidative stress. Over time, these changes can manifest in neurological and developmental disorders. Beyond the visible and tangible. Unlike a needle injection or a visible toxin, EMFs are invisible, odorless, and silent. This invisibility often means their potential harm is overlooked. We can't easily point to an EMF exposure event and say, here's where it all went wrong. Yet over the past 25 years, as wireless technology adoption skyrocketed, so did the prevalence of conditions like autism and ADHD. Correlation does not equal causation, but the timelines and emerging research suggest a relationship that demands scrutiny. Why it's not just better diagnosis. The environmental context. Shifting baselines over decades. Going back 25 years, autism was far less common, often cited as 1 in 10,000 or even 1 in 100,000 children. Today, that number hovers around 1 in 36, depending on the source. While some of this increase is attributable to better diagnostic criteria, changes in awareness, and broader definitions, the numbers have risen too sharply to be explained by these factors alone. Something else in our environment has changed dramatically during this period: our exposure to EMFs. The technology boom post, 1989. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and others have pointed to the late 1980s as a pivotal point. Around 1989 and onward, households began adopting new technologies at a rapid pace. Cordless phones operating in higher and higher frequency bands became common. Wi-Fi routers and eventually smartphones followed. Children born into this era faced a biological environment saturated with EMFs in ways previous generations did not. The inadequacy of the just better diagnosis narrative, better detection versus actual increase. While improved detection certainly reveals cases that went unnoticed in the past, it does not fully explain the magnitude of the increase. Parallel trends. The timing of the rise in autism rates parallels the introduction and pervasive use of EMF-emitting devices. This coincidence prompts a re-examination of environmental factors. Ignoring underlying causes, accepting that it's just better diagnosis can prevent us from exploring crucial underlying environmental influences, such as EMFs, that deserve attention. The misclassification of RFR health risks, why EMFs are not off the hook. The Regulatory Gap Federal Communication Commission, FCC standards for EMF exposure were set decades ago and focus only on thermal effects, whether the radiation can heat tissue. Modern science now shows that non-thermal effects, including oxidative stress and VGCC activation, can have significant biological consequences at levels far below current safety limits. Thus, the regulatory framework is antiquated, failing to account for the subtle, chronic influences of EMFs on developing brains. Industry versus public health. The wireless industry is a trillion-dollar enterprise, and acknowledging that EMFs could pose serious health risks would carry profound implications. This economic and political pressure may contribute to the continued misclassification of RFR health risks, where the burden of proof remains unreasonably high. As a result, we lack adequate regulations to protect children who are more susceptible to these influences due to thinner skulls, developing nervous systems, and longer lifetime exposure. EMFs as entropic waste. Scientists and theorists have begun to classify EMF exposure as a form of entropic waste, introducing chaos into the delicate bioelectric processes that govern cellular communication and gene expression. This perspective helps us understand EMFs not as a simple, harmless byproduct of modern life, but as a pollutant that could be distorting the information landscape within our cells. Diving deeper biological mechanisms, linking EMFs to developmental disorders. Voltage-gated calcium channels, VGCCs. One of the best documented mechanisms is how EMFs trigger VGCCs in cell membranes. When activated improperly, these channels allow excessive calcium ions to flood into cells. Elevated intracellular calcium leads to increased nitric oxide and reactive oxygen species, ROS, creating oxidative stress and inflammation. Over time, this biochemical turbulence can damage DNA, disrupt neuronal signaling, and potentially contribute to conditions like autism. Oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction. EMF exposure has been associated with mitochondrial dysfunction, mitochondria being the powerhouses of our cells. When the cell's energy production is compromised, essential developmental processes can go awry. Oxidative stress induced by EMFs can also fragment DNA in sperm and possibly ova, meaning that disruptions to healthy development may begin even before conception. Epigenetic changes and cell M theory. Epigenetics involves changes in gene expression without altering the DNA sequence. EMFs may induce epigenetic modifications that alter how genes are turned on or off during critical developmental windows. According to the cellular latent learning model, CLM theory, cells learn from their environment like neural networks, processing signals over time. When EMFs introduce noise into these signals, the result can be low-fidelity gene expression, possibly leading to neurological and developmental abnormalities, including autism, ADHD, and related conditions. CLM theory, a framework for understanding entropic waste. What is CLM? The Cellular Latent Learning Model, or CLM, posits that cells operate as learning systems. Instead of seeing DNA as a static blueprint, CLM views genetic material as dynamically interacting with the environment, constantly interpreting signals that guide gene expression and cellular behavior. Over evolutionary time, life has optimized this system to maintain remarkably high fidelity in transmitting genetic and epigenetic information. Entropic waste in low-fidelity environments. Entropic waste, including EMFs, disrupts this high-fidelity environment, introducing informational chaos that confuses cells. With prolonged exposure, the cellular learning processes degrade. This degradation could explain the uptick in complex developmental disorders that are not easily traced back to a single chemical or vaccine ingredient. Instead, it's the cumulative distortion from EMFs that may be undermining the cellular machinery needed for balanced neurological development. The bigger picture, it's not just one factor. Vaccines represent a tangible, well-studied component of children's health decisions, but focusing on them exclusively ignores the broader, subtler forces at work. CLM theory underscores that environmental health is multifactorial. Entropic waste, RFR, toxins, and other pollutants acts in concert, disrupting cellular processes in ways we are just beginning to understand. By expanding our lens, we see that the noise introduced by EMFs might be more pervasive and harmful than previously acknowledged. The fertility connection's sperm quality and wireless radiation. Sperm quality declines. A surprising link emerges when we examine reproductive health. Men's sperm quality has declined dramatically over the past 2 decades. Research by Al-Salihi et al. And others has shown decreasing sperm concentration, motility, and morphology, coupled with increasing DNA fragmentation in sperm cells. What changed during this period? The ubiquity of wireless technologies and EMF exposure, autism, sperm DNA fragmentation, and intergenerational effects. Studies connect higher levels of sperm DNA fragmentation with increased ASD rates in offspring. If paternal germ cells carry genetic and epigenetic damage due to EMF exposure, the consequences may manifest as developmental disorders in the next generation. This helps explain why conditions like autism have risen in parallel with wireless technology adoption. It's not just about what happens after birth, but what's happening at conception and even before, at the cellular level. Beyond vaccines, the reproductive dimension. While vaccine debates remain front and center, the reproductive health data offers a stark reminder that we must broaden our investigative lens. Men keeping cell phones in their pockets, living near high-frequency Wi-Fi routers, and constant close-range EMF exposure could be introducing subtle but significant genetic disruptions that contribute to ASD prevalence. Vaccines do not explain this reproductive angle. EMFs do. The technological timeline. Correlating the adoption of wireless tech with autism rates. Late 1980s and early 1990s. A turning point. RFK Jr. and others have pointed out that autism rates began to climb noticeably around 1989. What else happened then? A surge in the adoption of cordless phones, which emit wireless radiation at various frequencies, from the early 27 MHz models to 900 MHz and eventually 2.4 GHz. Soon after came the widespread use of Wi-Fi in the late 1990s and the explosion of cell phone use and smartphone adoption, wealth, adoption, and incidence rates. Initial increases in autism diagnoses were sometimes noted first in wealthier populations. those more likely to adopt new wireless technologies early. As these devices became cheaper and more ubiquitous, the rest of the population caught up, and so did autism rates. This pattern suggests an environmental factor linked to technology adoption, not just an error in diagnosis or a vaccine effect. Political derangement syndrome, failing to address EMFs. Some critics argue that by focusing solely on vaccines, certain political or advocacy groups fall into a form of derangement syndrome. They ignore the invisible but substantial EMF exposures that grew in tandem with autism rates. This selective blindness can lead to misguided policies and missed opportunities to protect children by updating safety guidelines for RFR exposure. Challenging the status quo. Why EMFs need more attention? Why has EMF research been overlooked? Invisible and intangible, EMFs don't leave an immediate, obvious signature on the human body, making them easy to dismiss. Economic pressures also play a role. The telecommunications industry is massive, and acknowledging EMF risks could mean enforcing stricter regulations that might hinder rapid technological expansion. Additionally, regulatory standards have not kept pace with modern research. Old thermal models of EMF safety fail to consider non-thermal biological effects. There is a need for updated guidelines. Regulations must recognize that EMFs have biological impacts at levels far below those causing tissue heating. Protecting vulnerable populations, such as children, pregnant women, and individuals with electromagnetic hypersensitivity, deserves special consideration. Policy reforms are essential. Governments and health agencies must push for more research funding, transparent guidelines, and better public education about EMF exposure. This is not just about policymakers and scientists. Parents, educators, and healthcare providers must demand safer technologies, understand how to reduce EMF exposure, and balance convenience with caution. Simple steps, like using wired internet connections or placing routers away from sleeping areas, can reduce EMF exposure at home. The bigger picture: entropic waste and bioelectric health. EMFs, love, and life's delicate balance. Humans are beings of energy and information. Our cells rely on finely tuned bioelectric signals to guide development, maintain health, and even influence mood and cognition. EMFs disrupt this symphony by introducing static that breaks the harmony. This isn't just about disease, it's about preserving the essence of life's natural balances. If we truly care about protecting children from neurological disorders, we must broaden our approach. Autism and other conditions are likely multifactorial, arising from a confluence of genetics and environmental triggers. By zeroing in exclusively on vaccines, we neglect the forest for the trees, the complex interplay of EMFs, toxins, epigenetics, and bioelectric signaling that shapes early brain development. Ignoring EMFs because they are invisible is a dangerous form of denial. Like chemical pollutants, EMFs represent a form of environmental noise that disturbs biological order. Understanding and mitigating EMF exposure is just as critical as ensuring safe water, clean air, and uncontaminated foods. Failing to do so may mean a future in which each generation experiences progressively lower fidelity in gene expression and higher rates of neurodevelopmental and fertility-related issues. Practical steps for parents and policymakers. For parents, reducing EMF exposure is key. Use wired internet connections when possible. Keep wireless routers and devices away from sleeping areas. Turn off Wi-Fi and electronic devices at night. Limit children's screen time and keep cell phones out of their bedrooms. Spread awareness by informing other parents, educators, and community members about the potential risks of EMFs. Support organizations advocating for updated safety guidelines. For policymakers and health agencies, updating safety standards is crucial. Incorporate non-thermal biological effects into EMF exposure guidelines. Fund independent research to clarify EMF health relationships. Public education is also vital. Launch campaigns to raise awareness about safe technology practices. Support training for healthcare providers to counsel families on minimizing EMF exposure. Regulatory accountability is necessary. Revisit FCC standards with modern science in mind. Engage telecom companies in dialogues about reducing EMF emissions and designing safer technologies. Conclusion: recognizing the real culprits in a digital age. For too long, the debate over rising autism rates has been dominated by arguments about vaccines, arguments that scientific consensus has settled. Vaccines are critical tools for public health, and the evidence against their role in causing autism is overwhelming. Yet, as autism rates continue to climb, we can no longer dismiss the possibility that other environmental factors are at play. EMFs and RFR, introduced by our rapid embrace of wireless technologies, represent a new frontier in understanding how the environment affects neurological development. The continuous, low-level exposure to these invisible fields could be subtly reshaping our cellular communication, gene expression, and ultimately, the developmental trajectories of our children. The cell-M theory and a growing body of research highlight the urgent need to study EMFs not as a fringe concern, but as a central public health priority. If we truly want to protect our children and future generations, we must broaden our investigative lens to include all plausible environmental threats. Ignoring EMFs while fixating on vaccines is a form of political and ideological derangement that does a disservice to children's health. It's time we acknowledge that EMFs are not off the hook. Let's push for updated regulations, invest in comprehensive research, and take preventive steps in our own homes. This is not about abandoning technology or living in fear. It's about recognizing that as we advance technologically, we must also evolve our understanding of health and safety. By seeing the big picture, embracing complexity, and confronting inconvenient truths, we stand a better chance of safeguarding our children's neurological health in a digital world. Visit RF Safe to learn more.